SLAC, now at SLAC, or formerly at MIT. Rebecca did her PhD at the University of Melbourne in 2017 and then moved to MIT, where she worked together with Tracy Slattery on the Galactic Center Gamma-Ray Excess and other topics. And now she moved to SLAC, but currently she is in Australia, stuck there because of visa issues to go back to the US. So please, Rebecca.
Great. All right, thanks very much for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to speak today. It's great to virtually be here. So today I'm going to tell you a story of the Galactic Center Gamma-Ray Excess. So this is a story that's taken a lot of twists and turns along the way, and it's also had a lot of surprises. So we've found a lot of things we didn't expect to find. So during the talk today, I'm going to give you kind of a chronological perspective. So I'm going to tell you about things as we came to learn them about the excess. So in the beginning, on to what the excess is. So we often call this the GCE, the Galactic Center Excess, about some of the characteristics of the excess. I'm going to tell you about the different hypotheses we have to explain what the excess might be. So the two leading hypotheses are either dark matter or a new population of millisecond pulsars. So I'll tell you about how you can maybe tell these different hypotheses apart, and I'll tell you all about the latest controversy and latest results that we have on understanding maybe what's going on. This will feature, of course, a number of things on systematics, the sort of subtleties that actually are going on behind these GC analyses. So I'll kind of start to wrap things up, tell you where things are now, and then the sort of ways we have to go forward. Is that a question or is it just feedback? No. Okay. Okay, so our story begins in June of 2008. So the Fermi Gamma-Ray Space Telescope had a very successful launch at Cape Canaveral off the back of the Delta II Heavy rocket. So it had a very successful launch and its mission has been very, very successful ever since. So it's lasted for a long time and it's still running even longer maybe than we would have thought that it would. So just a little bit about the Fermi telescope. So it's a gamma-ray telescope. It's sensitive to gamma rays from order a few hundred MeV up to a few TeV. It has a full sky field of view, so it in principle can see everything. It's just circulating around the Earth many times. So it's sitting in low Earth orbit. And the really great thing about the Fermi telescope is that all of its data is publicly available. So this means that you don't have to be a member of the Fermi collaboration to download the data, to analyze it, and to look into it however much you might feel like. So actually, perhaps surprisingly, only a year after Fermi launched, an excess was found in the gamma rays that it detected, so almost straight away. And it was a bit of a scandal that two theorists actually found this before the experimentalists did. So these two theorists were Lisa Goodenough and Dan Hooper. So in this 2009 paper, they presented that there seemed to be some evidence for excess GB gamma rays, but it wasn't totally clear what it was that they were finding. But they knew that it seemed to be at least highly statistically significant. So they're very bright, and they were peaked around a few GeV. So what this figure on the right is showing you, so that the sort of dashed line is just the sort of backgrounds that you might expect. You see there's some sort of peak, some sort of signal, and then the red dots are your data. So clearly there is some sort of excess over the background. And while a lot of people didn't really take this paper so seriously in the beginning, because after all, it was just two theorists playing with the data, over the next few years, after 2009, a number of different groups started to get some clues as to what the properties of the excess might actually be. So at least in the beginning, it looked like the morphology was actually something that was roughly spherically symmetric around the center of the galaxy. So this figure in the middle is just showing the thing is really brightly peaked. So this is a lot of counts in the middle, and then it's going out to flatten out further away from the center of the galaxy. So the sort of morphology looked like it scaled like r to the minus 2.4. So r is just the radius from the center of the galaxy. And interestingly, it looked like it extended out to around 10 degrees. So around 10 degrees means that really it's actually quite displaced from the center of the galaxy. It's a really big excess. And it's really separate to what we expect for most of, say, just the matter in the galaxy. It's not dark matter. It's mostly just in a flat disk. Instead, we see this giant sort of thing coming out of the middle. And very interestingly, it was shown that it actually roughly fit a standard sort of dark matter density profile called NFW. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the spectrum, sorry, about the morphology later and some of the updates. So in terms of its spectrum, it seems like the shape of the excess, so the shape of the energy of the gamma rays that you're getting, appears to be uniform throughout the inner galaxy. So it seems like it's the same thing that's actually producing the excess. So the figure on the left is just breaking the sky up into different regions. So you can see the flat sort of line is like just the plane. And if you look at all these different regions, you see the energy spectrum looks kind of the same. And that's what the figure on the right is showing. Just in different regions, the shape of the distribution of the gamma rays is pretty much the same. Now, if you couple this with the intensity of the signal, this is where things start to get even more interesting. So you can actually see that spectrum is really well fit by actually a GeV scale annihilating dark matter. So what the figure on the right is showing you, on the x-axis are different dark matter masses. Now, if you have dark matter particles, they can annihilate. They can then give you standard model particles, which then can decay the gamma rays that you're getting for different dark matter masses as they annihilate. And you fit the shape of the spectrum to just how intense you want to be, so to match the sort of brightness. On the y-axis is the intensity of the signal. So it actually seems like it matches roughly on what we would expect for a standard sort of thermal particle dark matter candidate. So the sort of scale you would expect is a factor of few times 10 to the minus 26 on this axis, and depending on which final state you go to, you can get a pretty good fit. So it's not expected of thermal particle dark. So at this stage, people started thinking, this has a lot of the properties of what we'd expect to see from dark matter, and it's also where we would expect potentially to see a dark matter signal. We know the center of the galaxy is very dense in terms of the dark matter content. So this seems to be the place to look if dark matter is going to be annihilating. Approximately spherical, extended well out of the center compared to just the sort of standard model matter. The intensity seemed to match thermal particle dark matter in that it could match the thermal relic annihilation cross-section. And this spectrum looked consistent in that it was invariant with both position and shape. So it looked like the thing was being produced everywhere. It wasn't just some event likely that was be exploding and causing this excess. So really looking at all these facts, it looked like maybe it was really, or maybe it is really a dark matter signal. And if it is dark matter, this would be the first evidence we have of dark matter interacting directly with the standard model. So all the evidence to date that we actually have for dark matter comes from its gravitational interactions. We don't know if it even interacts with the standard model at all. So if this signal really were a dark matter signal, this would be huge. The implications are so big for particle physics, cosmology, every type of physics you think about. So really this is something we want to get to the bottom of. We want to figure out if this really is dark matter, because if it is, it's very exciting. So all these sort of features were presented in a nice little package for the first time in 2015, a compelling case for dark matter. And to prove that people really started taking it seriously once this paper came out, you can look at Inspire at the citations per year that the original discovery paper by the two theorists in 2009 were getting as a function of time. So you see 2009, no one kind of cared it existed, maybe a few self-citations. Year after, a couple more, still not so much happening. But then you can see when this compelling case for dark matter paper came out, the citations exploded. Everyone, I guess anyone who was doing particle physics at the time everybody was writing model building papers trying to explain exactly what model might produce this signal. And everyone was very excited, and I think rightly very excited. But you might see there is an ominous feature in this plot, being that around 2015, the citations are going down. And there's a reason that happened. And that reason is what happened in 2015. So 2015 was a really big year for the excess, in that it actually was the first time the Fermi collaboration officially acknowledged the excess existed. So they released their own analysis showing that it looked like it was there. But also because alternative sort of hypotheses were really pushed to the front of what was happening with some really interesting new developments. So I just told you how dark matter can be a very exciting explanation for this signal. But there is something else. So the leading alternative sort of hypothesis are millisecond pulsars. So pulsars are just rapidly spinning neutron stars. I think even still, the best piece of evidence for pulsars of the excess are that the sort of gamma-ray energy spectrum that you get for these millisecond pulsars looks an awfully lot like the excess's gamma-ray energy spectrum. So it doesn't answer the question, but you might start getting suspicious when something you know exists has an energy spectrum that looks like something that you're finding in the center of the galaxy. So just as a really quick side note, so I'm going to start using the word point sources and pulsars kind of so you can think of pulsars as being sort of the physical interpretation of the point source, like what actually is the point source. And just what point sources are. So the pulsars will appear as point sources to Fermi, and this just means that they have angular extent below detector thresholds. So you just see them like a point. You just can't see any more information about them. Right, so you might wonder then, if the pulsars potentially explain the excess, why don't we just go looking for the pulsars, measure their energy spectrum in the center of the galaxy, and then just call it a day? So people have tried to do this, and it turns out that all of the pulsars that we actually have been able to resolve, so the ones that you can see as point sources, they can't explain the excess. At least we haven't found any of them so far. So this particular category, resolved point sources, can be the excess. But there's another type of point sources called unresolved point sources. Now these are too dim to be individually detected. So if you tried to look for one, you couldn't see it, they're just not very bright. But you could have a lot of these unresolved point sources, and you could imagine that collectively they could explain the galactic center excess. So you could just have a lot of really faint things, they add up to give you the right sort of intensity of the signal. So this is the class, the alternative sort of hypothesis we want to go for. This class of point sources called unresolved point sources. So is the excess dark matter, or is it these unresolved point sources? So we want to know how we can actually tell the difference between these two hypotheses. They might seem like they're going to be very similar, but thankfully there actually is something that maybe is going to give us some insight as to what the correct answer is. So this is the counts of gamma rays that you get from point sources actually exhibit very different statistical behavior compared to those you get from annihilating dark matter. And you can see this from the simulation that's shown in the middle. So on the left, and if you have dark matter just exists in some sort of continuous halo, and then all the dark matter particles can just annihilate and then give you these gamma rays. So it looks very bright in the center. It's generally smooth, continuous, and then kind of goes off. If you wanted to think about it in terms of statistics, the dark matter follows Poisson statistics, or anything that's smooth follows these Poisson statistics, in the sense that if you want to think about the number of gamma rays you get from a given pixel looking in the center of the galaxy, you just need one Poisson draw for the number of gamma rays that you might get for an annihilating dark matter pair. If you compare this to point sources, so the figure on the right, you see it looks much more clumpy. And this is because you could imagine in a given pixel of the sky, a given part of the sky, you might have no pulsars, so you just get no gamma rays. And you could imagine in a different pixel, you might have several pulsars that give you a lot of gamma rays. So the pixel to pixel variation can be quite high. And overall, the signal looks a bit more clumpy. So you see that they're kind of scattered everywhere, as opposed to giving you a smooth signal. The sort of statistics that this follows is non-Poissonian statistics. And the reason for this is, compared to the dark matter case, if you don't know where these sources are, because they're unresolved, you can't see them, you have to do a Poisson draw for the probability you just have a source in your pixel to begin with. And then you need additional Poisson draw for the number of gamma rays you're going to get from the sources in a simplified sense. So the statistics are quite different. You get a different looking signal. You get something that's either smooth or clumpy. So we want to look for smooth and clumpy signals. Which one is it going to be? So we also want to put these statistics on within some sort of broader fitting framework. And one that's been used for the excess before is called template fitting. And the way template fitting works is you just want to build up a picture of the gamma ray sky by modeling individual components that you would expect to be in the sky. So these are something called templates, and you can just think of them as so for example, these could come from some model of something that you already have or expect, some ansats or some catalog of things you've already measured. So to just give you an example how this could work, so the little picture at the top shows you the full sky gamma rays as an example. And then you could just put together different combinations of these different sort of spatial distributions or templates, let them all float in the fit, and just see what does the fit give you as the best fit. How much flux does it put into each template or each spatial distribution? Even better, you can do a version of this template fitting called non-Poissonian template fitting, where you put the smooth or clumpy statistics effectively on one of these templates. So you ask the fit, if I give you smooth sort of statistics or clumpy sort of statistics, how much flux do you want to put into each distribution? And the thing we're going to be most interested in is for the GCE. So this is the one shown on the right, looks roughly spherically symmetric. Does the fit want that template to be clumpy, or does it want it to be smooth? And this was shown in this 2015 paper. So you're going to see a few plots that look a bit like this in the rest of the talk. So I'll just take a bit of time to explain what the plots are actually showing. So what you see on the x-axis is the fraction of flux that's going into particular templates. So you'll see there's some sort of peak that's peaked on, say, for example, the blue one in the background's peaked to about 5%. So that means for that particular template, 5% of the gamma ray flux goes into that template. The dashed lines are just showing you sort of the 95% containment levels of the flux that it expects. And on the y-axis is just the posterior probability. We have this because it's just being used as a Bayesian sort of framework. So it's just saying how much flux is likely to be in each template. So results that were found in 2015. So right before this paper came out, the status was what you see in the red box. Before you put point sources or sort of clumpy type statistics onto the excess template, so what's seen as just the red peak around 7% is the dark matter template. So that was the 2014 paper. Everyone's like, great, looks like dark matter signal. But as soon as you add this extra template that has these non-Poissonian statistics, or that looks really clumpy, what happens instead is the dark matter template gets pushed to 0. So dark matter is seen as the red thing just heaped on 0. And instead, the whole of the flux was absorbed by the point source template. And that's what's shown in yellow. So you can see it's also about 7% of the flux. So it looked like the fit did not want any dark matter or anything that was smooth, looked like the excess. And instead it wanted point sources. And an interesting thing from this paper that was shown is something called the source count function or luminosity function. So all this is just a function that's taking into account the fluxes that you have of different point sources. So it's like a distribution of point sources a function of how bright they are. So the one that's interesting on the right is the orange one. And what it shows is, so the other ones are just other point source sort of distributions we don't care about so much. What I found was this new orange sort of shape that shows you that because it's kind of flat on the lower flux side, there's a lot of fainter sources, and then very quickly it drops off, which is there aren't so many really bright ones. And what was interesting about this particular plot is when you see it really starts to plummet, that's right where Fermi's sensitivity actually drops off. So it seemed like they found there was evidence for these unresolved point sources, but they were just below what Fermi could see. So we only just missed out on seeing them. So after this paper in 2015, it really did look like that's pretty solid evidence that the explanation probably is point sources, probably not dark matter. But there was not only just one paper in 2015, there was actually another paper done by an independent group of people using an independent method. And they came to all sorts of conclusions. So this is something called the wavelet method. And the way this works is you use something called a wavelet transform to look for peaks in the data. So you can kind of just think of this like a Fourier transform. You're just looking for sort of some signal or peak over your background. And just as before, if you have something that looks clumpy, so the peaks, that corresponds likely to point sources. If you instead find that the data wants something that looks very smooth, so you don't find peaks, that's consistent with they're just so faint that they look like they're effectively smooth. They're really not bright. So what you see on the left is the point sources they found in 2015 using their method. The different brightness of the dots are just how significant they are. And really interestingly, what's shown on the right was if you just added up, so we just stacked all these different point sources, you find they gave you the excess sort of intensity. And that's what's shown on the right. So you see this sort of band that says GC intensity, and there's this green sort of circle thing that just significance contours. And so just stacking all these sources they found in this method gave you pretty much bang on the GC intensity. So it looks pretty convincing. And it wasn't just that paper, there were two different papers, two different methods, two different groups. So at this stage, I think almost everyone, most people were really sold. The excess isn't dark matter, it's point sources. And this particular explanation for the excess really reigned. So we didn't see so much happening in terms of dark matter anymore. And you can see evidence for this in the citation plot. People started kind of to lose interest, at least the particle physicists amongst us weren't as excited anymore. It's very interesting for astrophysics, but not so much for dark matter. Right. So this is kind of how things stood for a few years. And finally, this is actually where I come into the story. So before this stage, I was an outsider and hadn't really, only just kind of heard on the outside of what was happening. But I think of the two different methods, the one that I personally found kind of more interesting was this non-Poissonian template fitting. And the reason why I thought it was really interesting was because you could extract these different spatial distributions and you could ask distributions in the different shapes. So I got really interested in why that was kind of giving the result that it was giving. So what is driving this preference for point sources? So together in work I did with Tracy Slatcher, we asked the question of really what is driving this preference? So if there are some point sources present, but they don't follow one of the templates, being, we only have some fixed combination of these different shapes, what happens if you're not actually modeling everything correctly or you missed some other sort of distribution that really should be there? So what happens when you do this? And is it possible that this could push up the point source signal found with the current templates and push down the inferred dark matter signal? So we set out to investigate if a bias like this was possible in two different ways. So first of all, just using simulated data. And the good thing about simulated data is you have some sort of handle on what's happening. You know exactly what you simulated, so you generally know what you'd expect if you analyze that data that you made yourself. So you kind of know what goes into it. We also investigate what happens in the real data, which in principle is harder to do, but I'll tell you about in a second. So first, simulated data. So what we did was we simulated some point source population deliberately that we weren't going to include in our analysis, just to check if you miss something, what happens. And the new ingredient that we simulated were actually point sources in something called the Fermi bubbles. So on the right, this is what the gamma ray data looks like. You see this big structure above and below the plane of the galaxy. These are called the Fermi bubbles. And people, even still, aren't so sure what's happening with these bubbles. They're a pretty big mystery. But we thought, let's just put some point sources in a simulation inside these bubbles and see what happens. So this is going to be our sneaky source of bias. So we're going to put them in. We're going to put in then all the sort of backgrounds we expect are already there. So some of these things look smooth. But really importantly, we're also going to sneak in a dark matter signal. So we're going to have some dark matter signal that's of the size of the excess, and we're going to put point sources in the bubbles. This is it all. Okay, so what happens? So first of all, just to check that everything was working correctly, we analyze the data with exactly the same templates, being we first simulate the point sources, put them in the bubbles. We then, when we do an analysis, the selection of templates that we include includes this bubbles template. So just make sure that if we analyze the data with the same thing we simulated, do we get the same thing back? So it's just like a bit of a sanity check that the whole thing isn't just fundamentally wrong. And thankfully we do get the same normalizations. So you see this injected dark matter line, that's the amount of dark matter that was simulated. So on about 2% of the flux. And we see that then once we analyze this data, we get this peak with the dark matter. So it clearly does find that it's there. And these bubbles in the background. So now the particularly interesting part, what happens now if we instead analyze the data with NFW distributed point sources? So this is just excess, Galactic Center Excess looking point sources. instead of the bubbles point sources. So we're going to deliberately drop the bubbles template from the analysis selection. What happens? It doesn't find the dark matter, and the point sources instead go into this NFW or GCE point sources instead. So the dark matter signal ends up being misattributed to point sources. And you can see this very clearly from the plot. The dark matter is heaped on 0, doesn't think it's there, doesn't pick it up, and instead the fit attributes the simulated dark matter signal and the bubbles point sources together as being an excess point source signal, which clearly isn't right because we know what we put into our simulation. Then we kept adding in more and more dark matter just to see what would happen. So this time we deliberately injected or simulated about 5% of the flux fraction to be dark matter. It still didn't find it. You see the bands, the kind of inclusion bands for dark matter are getting bigger, but they're still not overlapping with really how much we put in. And we found that eventually there was a threshold in simulations. So you had to inject a lot of dark matter before it actually found some, but it still didn't find all of it. So as you can see from this figure here, that where it reconstructs dark matter is still short of how much we actually put in. So the point of this was that really we demonstrated that crosstalk between these different templates or spatial distributions of the components of the data appear to be possible. And this, we showed this happens if you have some, or can happen if you have a component present. So if you just don't know how to model the things in the center of the galaxy well enough, you might end up getting an answer that looks like point sources when that's not actually what's happening in the data for real. So we also found that there was a really large base factor or just statistical preference for adding in this point source template and pushing the dark matter down, like what they saw in the 2015 paper. And again, in this case, we know dark matter is there. So this is evidence of some sort of biasing effect that can affect, what the results are. So you might also wonder, check the time. Okay. Are there bubbles point sources? So we did this in a simulation. The next obvious thing to check is this actually reality? And the answer is no. So there was no evidence for point sources in the bubbles when we looked for them deliberately. So why did I just tell you all this? So this serves as a proof of principle example of mismodeling impact. So it just shows you if you get the things wrong, this can happen. But at this stage, we hadn't shown this was really happening in the data. Maybe it was just a hypothetical sort of situation. Which is where we move into what happens on the real data. Is there another way to test if this is happening? So it seems like the bubbles point sources weren't there, so they weren't doing anything. But maybe there's some other sort of component that we're missing, and maybe that's hiding a dark matter signal. And then you have to think about as well, of course, we don't know how to really describe the real data. The inner galaxy is really a bit of a mystery. So we had to think about how could we find that this sort of effect was happening. And one thing you'll notice was with the bubbles case, when we kept injecting more and more dark matter, the amount of flux that was going into the wrong template, being point sources, was getting pushed up, roughly proportionally to how much went in. So it seemed like if this effect is really present in the real data, the point source template likely wouldn't be saturated in its ability to absorb the dark matter flux. So what we did was then just inject a fake dark matter signal into the Fermi data and just ask the question, does it find it? So this is the real challenge, because if this is happening in real data, there is a serious problem with how we're thinking about these results. If you inject the dark matter signal, you probably should find it. So how does the Fermi data look? On the left, if we just analyze it as is with a normal selection of templates, we don't inject dark matter, we find, agreeing with 2015, there is no dark matter, heaped on 0, and this NFW point sources are just the point sources distributed like the excess, and they're on about 2-3%. So that's there. So now I'm going to inject about 2% of the dark matter flux into the real data. What happens? In the real data, it doesn't find what you've injected. So you see this injected line that's around 2%. It doesn't pick up that flux at all. Instead, dark matter is heaped towards 0. And comparing the left and the right figures, you see that this NFW or GCE point sources has pretty much absorbed this dark matter flux. It's gone up by roughly 2% compared to what it was before. We then just tried to inject more dark matter, like the bubbles case. So this time I'm going to inject about 7% of flux. So you want to watch what happens. Does dark matter find that flux, or is it still heaped on 0? Still on 0, still doesn't find it. So this is a pretty big signal. At this stage, we're looking at something that's a factor few larger than the Galactic Center Excess. And instead, it seems to have put a lot of this flux into this NFW point sources. So this is intriguing. It's not finding it. So at this stage, we're just like, okay, it's time to just throw all the dark matter in the center and just see what happens. So this is the normal data. That is our bombarded signal. So lots and lots of dark matter, very bright. Is it going to find that? Eventually it does find it. So it finds some dark matter, which is what you see is this red thing, around 8% of the flux. But it still doesn't find all of it. So it's still putting the dark matter into the wrong sort of templates. So the kind of point of what's happening here really is that if you're getting things wrong in how you're doing your modeling, you can get the wrong answer. So we're seeing this both in this simulated example with simulated data and the real data. There seemed to be a significant preference against dark matter as the interpretation, even though in the case of the simulated data, we knew it was there, and then the real data, we injected it, we still didn't find it. So what we said is, and then you're just getting the wrong answer. So this could be because there is some other point source population we haven't found yet, we're not modeling correctly, or it could be we're just getting something else wrong, which doesn't seem that unlikely, given we don't know so well how the galactic center actually looks. So we said dark matter could substantially contribute to the galactic center excess. I'll just show you really briefly for a bit more intuition about why this was happening. So I just showed you versions where we were just injecting signals into the real data. And a few people wondered, well, if you're injecting something that looks really smooth and you inject it on top of sort of a point source signal, then maybe the reason it gets absorbed by the point source template is it just looks like the faint end of the point sources, being it looks like the faint end of these NFW point sources, and that's the reason why this happens. But we actually looked into this because it's of course a very good suggestion, but it's not what's happening. So what you see on the left is if we just give the dark matter template priors, we're doing a Bayesian analysis, so you give some sort of priors of what you think is physically reasonable. So of course you don't expect negative dark matter flux, it really makes sense. So if you just set the values of the normalization to be positive, you get something that looks like what's happening on the left. So dark matter heaped at 0, find the point sources. But then if you just, this isn't physical, but just to get a sort of intuition of what's happening, you can relax the prior range for the dark matter template and just see what happens. And that's what you see on the right. We did that as a test, and you see that the dark matter flux wants to be really negative. So it floats all the way to minus 10% roughly of the flux fraction, which doesn't mean anything. But what it tells you is the generosity of smooth signals, being dark matter versus really, really faint point sources, doesn't explain this behavior. And that the fit really just doesn't want, with the current modeling that's being used at this stage, just doesn't want anything that looks smooth at all, be it dark matter or faint sources at all. We also had the degree of over-subtraction being floating to negative values, vary with different diffuse models. So diffuse models are just kind of the giant pain in doing these bits. They make up like 80 to 90% of the gamma rays in the sky, and we can't model at the moment. There are a lot of improvements that are being done, but this is the one that carries the most uncertainty. And when we tried different versions of these diffuse models, we found you get different answers, being the thing was floating to negative values, difference on negative values. So it seemed likely that's what was causing this, but we couldn't prove it was that. We didn't know what it was, but that was certainly something that we considered. But overall, this was, all these sort of things were presented in a 2019 paper called Dark Matter Strikes Back. And it kind of left the status of this search as a bit of a question mark. We didn't show it was dark matter. We didn't show it was point sources, of course. But it just seemed like there was a pretty big systematic here that we needed to understand, or everyone needed to understand, before they claimed we knew what was going on, effectively. But that was still quite a big result in the sense that this was one of the main methods that was used to show we had some evidence for these unresolved point sources of the excess. But it seemed like the whole thing wasn't robust and it needed to be looked into a bit more. Not only that, actually, also in 2019, another independent group of authors challenged this independent paper as well with the wavelets. So this was reevaluated. And what actually happened in the meantime between 2015 and 2019 is the Fermi collaboration came out with a new point source catalog. So what actually happened was, so a point source catalog, if you haven't heard of one before, is just like a list of point sources as a function of their flux, so like how bright they are and then where they are. And if there's a new point source catalog, one of the things you want to do is say, okay, if I look in there, am I going to find something that explains the excess? So an independent group actually looked into this, and they actually reproduced the wavelet results. And it turns out the 2015 paper did correctly find point sources. And so you see on the left, when they redid their analysis, they then compared it with this new point source catalog. It's called the 4FGL catalog. And now anything that has a red circle around it is in the 4FGL catalog. So it looks like all these peaks that were being found now are actually mostly known. And then the really exciting thing is, if you actually have this new point source catalog, you can look exactly into the catalog and just visit the excess. So they did this, and then it turns out the bulk of these point sources are just not the excess. This can't actually explain what the excess is. And the way this was shown, so the figure on the right is showing you the energy spectrum for the excess. So x-axis is just energy, y-axis is you have the E squared d and dE. It's like their energy squared times the number of them with their energy. And before we had this new point source catalog, the thing looked like the blue line. So I think it's curved at the top. So you can then just deliberately block out all these point sources now that you know, and just check, does the excess change? If you block them out and the excess is the same, then the point sources are not the excess. And they do exactly this, and this is the new mask, it's orange on the top. Looks like those are not the excess after all. What you're seeing in green underneath that, just looking in the catalog, what things that are in there are not excluded as being part of the excess, in the sense that maybe if you look in there, it tells you it's extragalactic, or it tells you that it's not a pulsar, or it's something else, then it can't be that. So you can stack these and see it best. You can get this orange, sorry, this green sort of curve, but that can't explain the excess. It's not high enough. So we need something else. So the right-hand side shows that these point sources are not the bulk of the excess. My paper with Tracy showed we need to look into the systematics of this other method. So I think this really was the other. Where are we at now? So in the time after we had this paper, we tried to think really hard just to figure out what was going on. Because at the time we didn't really know. We had ideas. We thought the diffuse model, this thing that makes up most of the gamma rays, is probably the culprit. But do we know that's true? Or do we know there are other ways we can get a handle on this? And the sort of direction that we went with was just checking the effects of additional freedom to templates. So the reasoning with this was just that if you're not modeling something correctly, when you do your fit, if you just have very rigid sort of templates that are wrong, they're going to be more wrong if you're not giving them more freedom. So we just thought, okay, we give them a bit more freedom, break them into pieces, let the extra pieces then flow. The first things we did was actually really simple. And it was just to break the Galactic Center Excess template, the one that looked kind of like dark matter, into two pieces. So just north and south, and let them float independently and see what happens. And in the beginning, this was an absolute shock. But it turns out if you just separate the north and south pieces, the preference for point sources completely disappears. And the preference for point sources with some of these particular sort of backgrounds models we were using was really large. Like, at least if you want to think about it in terms of sigma, easily over 10 sigma. And just by giving the template north-south freedom, the preference disappears. So you can see in this very busy plot, probably overly busy plot, what's happening in this plot is the north and south point source templates are just pretty much on zero, if you can see it. But instead what you find is for the smooth templates, you get this one that's north, this one that's south. They're separated from zero quite significantly. And then really weirdly, the north has picked up roughly twice the amount of flux as the south. This seemed really crazy. So then we thought, okay, looks like there's no point sources. Let's just take them out of the fit and just put only the smooth components. So just the north and south, and just do a morphology test for what morphologies the excess want. And it seemed like it really the data really strongly preferred something with additional freedom, being this north-south symmetry. So you see here like a factor 2 brighter in the north, which was pretty weird. But then usually if you find something like this happening, you want to just test simulations to see if I simulate something that I think is the right fit, how will it behave when I'm getting things wrong later? So effectively, if I do a simulation again, I know what I put into it, so I can play some games to see what happens when I change the analysis and how it looks on the other end. And this is what we did. So we simulate any point sources. We just put in north and south, smooth GCE. And then what we want to do is analyze it with just one set. So just one symmetric template over the whole region for both point sources and something that's smooth, just like was done in those previous studies. And we want to see what happens in the real data. Can we actually reproduce what the real data was doing before? So this is the real data in the region that we're looking at. So again, dark matter's on 0. We're looking at a different region to last time. So you can see these NFW point sources or Galactic Center Excess point sources. In this region is the whole excess, it's about 15%. If we let the dark matter template go negative, this is kind of just the thing that's in a proxy for this injection test. The dark matter does go a bit negative. And on the right, this is what this source count function looks like. So I mentioned this really briefly before. This is just a function of how many sources you have. Shows you pick up some new population. That's all it's telling you. There's something there, and it looks like it has this particular distribution. Now, for the really interesting part, let's now look at the simulate just a north-south symmetry, simulate no point sources, and just analyze it being only give the analysis model this one symmetric template with point sources. What happens? What happens is we reproduce the data. We reproduce the data in extreme detail, which is really exciting. So you can just compare the top to the bottom panel and see this actually looks like this might explain what was happening the whole time, potentially. So on the bottom left-hand side, you see you have dark matter on 0. It picks up point sources. We did not simulate these, yet the fit thinks they're there. The fit thinks that they're to the same statistical significance in the real data when you analyze it that way. Then we let the dark matter go negative. It goes negative, just like the real data. And we also see we have this population of point sources in blue, which don't exist. So we did not put these into our simulation, yet this can reproduce the data. So this was presented in 2 different papers I had just earlier this year. One of them called Spurious Point Sources in the Galactic Center Excess. So maybe you can see why we call them spurious, because, and you can fake them if you just get your analysis wrong, it looked like. So the particular case it was showing, unmodeled asymmetry, led to this spurious point source signal as the excess. And we found we could reproduce this sort of behavior in pretty good detail in simulations. So what does that mean? And how can we, still you might wonder why, which is, I think often people think, why is this happening? This time, I think we do understand why this happened. And you can think of this more broadly as just being that any mismodeling that you might have can actually give you this point source signal. And the reason why this happens, so remember I told you earlier for looking at just the different statistics you have for point sources, the variance was quite large from pixel to pixel. So just remember I told you in a given pixel you might have nothing, another pixel you might have lots of pulsars that are really bright. So the variance is large. So statistically you're just looking for large variance. And statistically, this is what an incorrect model looks like. An incorrect model, it's wrong, so you're going to have some large sort of discrepancy in what you think you're actually finding. So this increased variance is a feature of this point source signal. So it seemed that just generally that variance from mismodeling can be misattributed to variance from point sources when they don't actually exist. So we don't prove in our paper that this problem is as we've shown for this asymmetry. We do to some degree. We have a like analytic sort of demonstration of how this happens. But overall, it seems like still the systematics are really still not well enough controlled. The fact you can get very convincing detection that is apparently robust to all these different sort of analysis choices. No matter what we did, the thing stayed there as a fake signal. It was really hard to make it. You couldn't make it disappear by just changing different things in your analysis, other than giving it this north-south freedom. So it seemed like the claimed point source evidence doesn't seem like it's robust. You can fake this signal. I think it's difficult to be convinced if you're doing this analysis that the thing you're finding is really a true point source signal. So it was challenged, and I think at this stage we've shown, at least as it is, that it's not currently robust. That doesn't mean that there won't be some really interesting variations done in future or some other improvements that could make this work. But for the meantime, I think it's fair to be skeptical of results you see with this method. I'll just check for time. Okay. So just quickly, we've had even more really interesting recent developments on this method as well. So on the same day that our other two papers that I just mentioned earlier came out, there was actually an update to what we were finding in a paper from last year, the Dark Matter Strikes Back paper. So in this nice paper by Bushman et al., they showed that this injection test probably was going wrong because of diffuse mismodeling. And the way they showed this was that they just got a much better diffuse model than the ones that had been used for this non-Poissonian template fitting in the past. And they found that if you just use this new model, you could reproduce this sort of negative dark matter flux as well. And they also presented a nice new way to try and improve some of these problems. Being that if, in a similar sort of way, break templates into spherical harmonics and give these harmonics room as well, this can improve how your results look more reasonable. And what they showed in their paper was the point source preference seemed to be robust to these specific variations in diffuse models, in the sense that they always found they had a point source preference in this new diffuse model. So that's what's shown on the right. So the left is showing you this blue thing going negative, is just dark matter flux going negative. On the right is their new model. And they show you pretty much that you get some point sources, that's orange, and you get dark matter, that's blue. But unfortunately, the same sort of logic that we found in our other two papers apply to this paper as well, in that it seems like you can sort of fake this point source signal just by getting things wrong. And it does seem like, just from some checks that we did, if you take this new diffuse model and then put it alongside a Galactic Center Excess template that has north and south pieces going, floating freely as well, you find you get the asymmetry as well. So it seems like we still haven't sorted out what's happening here, but of course lots of interesting things could happen in the future. Okay, so I told you a lot of things about systematics. Systematics are really important when you're doing these types of analyses, just because we don't understand so well what's how to actually model everything in the center of the galaxy. Ever done these sort of template analyses is aware this is difficult, and has always said these systematics can be a problem. But I just want to show you as an example of how hard this really is, and kind of why this keeps happening, why these things keep kind of going wrong, in case you haven't looked into these sort of things before. Now, all of the searches I was just telling you about, they're looking for unresolved point sources. So these are these ones that are really faint. You can't even, they're not bright enough for you to see them. If you look even just for resolved point sources, so it's not the excess anymore. This is just how well do we think we can detect point sources when they're really there. Even when they're really there. And that's what's being shown in these figures. On the left is a point source catalog that's found using one background model. And the sort of red squares are the point sources that are found to over 5 sigma. So they're pretty confident they're there. At the right, you use a different background model, and the red dots are showing you where those predict over 5 sigma the point sources are. And these are the really bright ones. So even with the really, really bright ones, using these different background models that we don't understand so well, you get different predictions at 5 sigma for different point sources. So it seems like it's just really, really difficult to know for sure what's happening. And this is, it's always been a problem with the excess, and it's still a problem, I think, for the excess, that it's just hard to know if you really robustly have anything. And this comes back to the key point that really all of these diffuse models, so these are the thing that make up most of the gamma rays in the sky, are just bad. So even the very best ones we have, including the new ones that are presented in the more recent papers, don't give you good fits to the data. So what the plot on the left is showing you, if you were to fit to the real data, even with what you think is your really good sort of background model, you fit to the data, you get some best fit parameters. And then if you take those best fit parameters, take some simulated data and analyze it back, you'll get some sort of likelihood or hypotheses. So you can do that, and then you can compare the real data with the simulated data. Do they give you the same sorts of likelihoods when you're testing particular sort of hypotheses? And you find they don't, and they very badly don't. So this plot is showing what you would expect under simulation if you wanted to reproduce the real data. Like if you had something that explained the data to the level of Poisson noise, it should sit in these bounds. And instead what you see, even with these new good, so-called good diffuse models at low energies, which is where the excess is, so this 2 to 4 GeV range, so that's where the excess peaks. And it looks like we don't have a very good description of the data at this point. And if you don't have a good description of the data, your modeling is going to be wrong. So this means you're probably going to have a number of systematics, or potentially you're going to have things you don't understand that then kind of propagate through analysis and give you something that doesn't look quite right in the end. But you don't know that necessarily at the time. So really a key thing moving forward for this Galactic Center Excess is to understand these diffuse models better and to make better versions of these. I'd also like to say this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and do things. Of course, it's important to see what results we do get in a particular context, just so we know how to move forward and what things to start thinking about. But I think there's reason to be skeptical if anyone tells you they know robustly or totally what's happening. It's really hard to know. Okay, so current picture. I've told you a whole lot of things about how the picture has changed over the years, but where do we sit now? So I told you on the morphology at the start of the talk that it was found originally that the morphology fitted really well this NFW dark matter density, and particularly see the one that I cited at the bottom, that show instead maybe the morphology actually looks like a stellar bulge. Now, if that's true, that would tell you it's not dark matter that gives you the excess. But I don't think there is consensus in the field yet as to which morphology is the correct morphology. And this is simply because, again, these things are really hard to get right. And it could be just that if you change combinations of your modeling, you end up getting a different answer. And in the case of this bulge, in different papers, people have done different things like change the modeling and found the answers flipped. It hasn't happened in all papers, but it has happened in some of them. So while I don't think this is robustly known, at least yet, it has pretty big implications. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. In terms of the energy spectrum, it's still true that the spectrum is comparable to those of millisecond pulsars, and it's still true it can be fit well with dark matter, particularly if it annihilates to hadrons. In terms of the intensity, I think dark matter still wins on this point, in the sense it's well explained by dark matter because it's predicted by a thermorelic cross-section, if you believe that's the correct model that explains everything. But to get a very specific intensity at this point, there is some growing tension for pulsars, particularly with these new wavelet results. Being they have a look and they mostly don't find any, they find hardly any new peaks or new point sources. So it looks like that if the point sources exist, you have to have a lot of them. And perhaps more than we ever thought you were supposed to have. So then you can start asking questions. How do you get so many? But this is an ongoing question. And just very quickly, okay, try and wrap up. So moving forward, how do we tell the difference? I think lots of people would like to know an answer to this question instead of seeing lots of back and forth of people not being sure, because this is a really difficult question to answer, which is why there's so much action in the community on what's happening. But let's think about different ways we might be able to solve this problem. And I think something that's going to be really helpful is just to not look in the galactic center. It's one thing at the gamma rays, or at least to look in other wavelengths, look for different sorts of signatures. And there's one pulsar, we expect we're going to get maybe these GeV gamma rays, but it can also pulse into radio, or it can pulse into other wavelengths. And there are actually a few upcoming and current radio telescopes that might be able to find these. So what's shown on the right is just as the x-axis is the period for the millisecond pulsars, and then the y-axis is the flux. So what's colored in the top are some of the sources that we might be able to find. So the point is, particularly in the next few years, maybe these upcoming radio telescopes will actually see the pulsars. So for example, using MeerKAT or the Square Kilometre Array. The other thing is, we might not find any, So they might be radio quiet. And then you can ask the question, are they just different pulsars? It'll be difficult to answer, but hopefully if they're the right answer, they show up. So that's just one example. For dark matter, I really think you want to see a signal elsewhere. I think people are never going to believe a signal from the center of the galaxy just because it's so hard to model, as I keep telling you. So we want to look for other places to just corroborate a signal. So hopefully it shows up somewhere else that looks consistent with the signal in the center of the galaxy. So one place that's ideal to look for these are dwarf toroidal galaxies. So these are really dark matter dense, have really low gamma ray backgrounds. Perfect place to look. And at the moment, really interestingly, there's actually no tension with the Galactic Center Excess. This has changed a little bit as analyses have changed. So the bottom left is showing an official Fermi analysis. The x-axis is dark matter mass, y is the thermal cross-section, sorry, thermal average cross-section. Dashed line is the thermal average expected, just from freeze out. Circles are fits to the excess. So it looks like the thing still is not really excluded, but it's kind of on the edge in the sense that if the excess really is dark matter, likely we expect to see a signal soon here. That said, again, if we don't see anything, you can bet there are going to be a lot of models that appear that show you why you don't expect this. So in principle, it's hard to ever really rule out, but it's a very interesting place to look. The figure on the right is just showing you that also in the past, some of the sort of uncertainties to do with the density modeling haven't really been taken into account correctly, and these can actually weaken the limits even further. So the figure on the right is showing these things should actually weaken by a factor of a few. So there is still room for now for dark matter. In just almost wrapping up. So in terms of having a signal already elsewhere, there is an excess in antiprotons that's been measured by the cosmic ray experiment AMS. It does overlap with the GCE, though there are a number of interesting papers recently pointing out maybe this is only just within what you expect when you take into account systematics. So different groups have tried to model the systematics with this. They get different answers for how significant this thing is. So I think it's hard to say with the antiproton excess if it's really a signal just yet, but it's still interesting. And it's interesting that it overlaps with the galactic center. So the figure on the left is showing you for different dark matter masses and annihilation rates for the GB excess and the antiproton excess. You have something in the middle. So maybe there's a common origin already. The figure on right showing you is just showing you that in terms of sort of more complete dark matter models, it's actually really easy to explain both of these signals without being ruled out by anything. So it's showing that for the GC protons, if you're looking at hidden sectors, as an example this plot is showing, it works for masses of around 50 to 100 GeV, and it's not ruled out. Okay. Other avenues, there's just like so many other avenues, so I can't tell you all of them. I'm just going to really quickly just mention a couple. One is checking the energy spectrum. So while I said that the energy spectrum is similar for dark matter and pulsars, the systematics for Fermi are really large below a GeV. So at this stage, it's at these sort of energies, its point spread function really degrades. But this is actually where the energy spectrum prediction from pulsars differs the most compared to dark matter. So if we have new MEV gamma-ray telescopes that can look in the MEV, they actually might be able to tell us the answer. And there are numbers such as Amigo and eAstrogram and some others that actually should be coming up soon. Hopefully we can look into this. Given what we're finding with our fits at the moment, I think it's very timely to start thinking about other sort of fitting techniques, and some really interesting work has been done recently on the front of machine learning. So Florian List at Sydney just led a paper actually looking at machine learning for the Galactic Center Excess. So just using neural networks to find what does the data actually prefer, they find that you actually have a smooth GCU preference, which is very interesting. And it's also interesting from the perspective that you get very different systematics. So for example, in their paper, they checked if you had some north-south asymmetry, would it sort of trick the fit into thinking it's point sources, but they don't find that in their case. So it's good to have complementary sort of handles on what's happening. We can do better measurements otherwise for the dark matter density. We can try and understand these pulsar populations better because we really don't understand them so well. Most importantly, as I've told you, better diffuse models would be great. Okay, so just very quickly, summary of the status. The summary is there's lots of controversy as to what's happening, and I think the really short answer is we don't know what's happening yet, but there's a lot of really interesting work being done. So we know the signal's there, an exciting possibility that it really is annihilating dark matter. The main arguments for it at this stage, I think, are that the signal has consistent intensity, the spectrum looks like it can match. Maybe the morphology is consistent, but there are some other papers more recently showing maybe it goes more like the stellar bulge. We'll have to see what happens there. Arguments against, maybe the morphology, again, systematics. The leading alternative are these millisecond pulsars. I think the most convincing argument for them is that the energy spectrum looks consistent. Also, perhaps the morphology. Arguments against are just, where are they? We haven't found any of these. And where are the X-ray binaries, being that when they were forming, we expect to potentially see other sort of systems that are kind of like from when they were being formed. We don't see them in any wavelength. There are questions of how you get such a large number of these pulsars in the center of the galaxy. But this is all an active area of research. Lots of people are doing lots of different interesting things to figure out what's going on. I also told you about previous 2015 point source evidence. All I'm going to say is that it seems like at the moment this has been challenged, and we need more work to understand what's happening. But I don't think at this stage, in terms of the point sources, that we have really any very convincing evidence that these sub-threshold sources are there. Lots of ways forward to hopefully get to the bottom of this. So we have these complementary searches for both dark matter and pulsars. We need to improve our modeling, and lots of different things that can still be done. But for now, the puzzle continues, and hopefully we'll get to the bottom of this sometime in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very nice and comprehensive talk. And so we have time for some questions. Who wants to go first? So you can just speak up or raise your hand. Maybe I take the opportunity and start. Okay, so you mentioned for dark matter explanation, is the profile which would fit it, is that still so steep as it used to be? So kind of, I remember in the beginning it was an NFW profile, but which was much steeper towards the center.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends what analysis you look at. I think usually you get something that is steeper, so they call it a generalized NFW profile. So this is something that has an index of like usually about 1.2 as opposed to 1, which is a sort of standard NFW profile. But you can fit it with a range still. So for example, in our analyses, just to check, we also just put in a normal NFW with the index of 1, and we found all the same sort of answers. In terms of the best fit, it can still vary a little bit, but generally most papers find something that is slightly steeper. So that's right.
Okay.
Rebecca,
Thanks.
first of all, thank you for the excellent talk. I had a question about the systematics of these models and some of how they behave.
Yep.
So if I understood you, giving freedom for the signal in the north and the south to be different is enough to essentially completely derange the original analysis, which found an excess of point sources. Naively, that suggests that the point sources that it would have found would have been disproportionately in one hemisphere. And that seems like the sort of thing that any competent systematic study or look back would have found, and evidently it didn't. So I feel like I must be missing something. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So when we were breaking up into the north and south hemispheres, when we put the point sources on north and south, and we had smoother north and south. And when we had north and south with the point sources, both of their flux went to 0. So the fit, when you gave it the north and south freedom, it didn't find point sources. So the fit never seemed to think you had to have many more point sources in the north compared to the south. But perhaps part of what you're wondering is it also just statistically why you would get a point source signal when you used one template over the whole region compared to having this north-south?
It's possible I'm misunderstanding, but if the original analysis that didn't allow for north-south asymmetry found instead, in responding to the north-south asymmetry that is actually present in the data, amped up the point source fraction that implies that it would have been, as it were, putting that excess point source strength disproportionately in one hemisphere. And was that sort of look-back analysis absent from the systematic studies that were originally done? Does the method of analysis not really allow for it?
Right, so in the original paper, they only ever tried having one point source template over the whole region. They never broke it up into a few pieces, so they never predicted that you should have a lot more in the north and the south. One thing they did mask out, so just like block out all the north and then analyze the south, then block out all the south and look at the north. And when they did that, they didn't find any really big difference. So they had, in some sense, looked for something kind of like this. But that sort of test is not the same as the one we did. And maybe if I just really briefly say a couple words about how these systematics happen, in the sense we don't actually expect that you get a lot of point sources in the north that look really bright. So they never thought that. We don't think that that's true. The reason that then the fit gives you this point source, the point sources everywhere kind of symmetrically, is just that if you simulate north that is 2 times brighter than the south, if you want to think about what statistics best fits that if I'm only going to give it one template. So you could ask, if I'm going to simulate just north twice as bright, south fainter, if I put one template on top of that, what can best sort of encapsulate those features? And if I put just a smooth template on top of that, it's really difficult just in terms of Poisson statistics to get an up fluctuation to cover the north half of the sky to give you double the flux. Compared to if you just put one point source template over the whole region, when really what's happening is the north is 2 times brighter, those sort of statistics kind of expect that to happen more frequently than if you just had Poisson statistics, in the sense that it's much statistically easier to have a number of point sources in the north that all up fluctuate to be much brighter than expected, because remember, they can have more variance. So it's more easy for them to all up fluctuate because that's kind of built into how they work. So that's kind of why it thinks the point sources, if you only give it one template, are a better fit to this asymmetry as opposed to something that's smooth. But in all cases, nothing is predicting that there are point sources that are in the north that are twice as bright in any of the papers. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It sort of does, although, and maybe your plot about the goodness of fit measure essentially answers this, that it's possible for the models to get in the data in this way, but it seems like if they're using point sources to describe what is in fact a disagreement in the smooth component, it feels like that's got to show up as a problem somehow, and you see it show up in terms of, or the plot that you showed anyway, it shows up as it's just not a good fit. Now, I'm not sure whether that was your analysis or someone else's analysis from this year, but
that one was the Bushman et al. Paper that had the quality of fit. So that was with the new diffuse models that people are using now.
Yeah, so basically the quality of the modelling and maybe the due diligence, the standards of due diligence have ticked up a little since the original paper as part of what you're saying.
Part of what you're saying, the fact that none of these are a good fit, we think is what's behind why this happens for sure. So you're right on that, we don't actually think for sure the asymmetry is even there at this stage because everything's a bad fit. It's just giving it more freedom is giving you
you can get artifacts if you do that, yes.
Yeah, for sure. But otherwise, getting point sources a better description of this smooth asymmetry just is statistically expected. So even in simulations, if you model everything perfectly, you still find this happens. And it's just because statistically, this sort of large variance is easier to explain in the framework of point sources than it is from something smooth.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, thank you very much.
On a similar note, do you find a qualitatively similar thing if you do other asymmetry? So not necessarily north-south, but east-west or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did check that. We checked east-west. It doesn't happen to the same degree for east-west. So it depended on what diffuse model, which background model that you used. So we found sometimes you could get an asymmetry. Some of them didn't do it. It didn't look like it was a consistent picture. So it seemed like it's a north-south thing. It's more likely where something's going wrong. So something's probably being mismodeled in this north-south.
I also had a question to do with whether or not there's been any investigation or I guess even curiosity into the center in galactic longitude and latitude, the fact that it's slightly off from 00. Is that considered to be interesting, or are people looking at that?
So you mean with the excess or with...
Yeah. So the excess is slightly off center, right?
Barely. I think it's approximately on center. So people, the closest thing is also when we started getting this asymmetry, what we also thought was maybe the whole thing is just off center up enough, and maybe it's a normal dark matter profile, because of course you don't expect dark matter to be brighter on one side in the north and the south. But it seems like there was some sort of anomaly actually that happened maybe like 5-10 years ago, where it required that you had some offset sort of signal for dark matter. I can't remember which one it was. But they actually found that there are pretty strong constraints on going too far off the center. And this kind of makes sense because you could think that in terms of if you're going to get a dark matter signal, just how it kind of gravitationally forms, you have some gravitational potential and it's going to be the center of the galaxy. So it's pretty difficult, I think, to move anything around too much if it's dark matter. But if it's pulsars, it's, yeah, sure, it's more likely to explain something that's asymmetric like that. But yeah, no one specifically in the context of the excess, I think, has looked at that.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. We should close the official part here. Rebecca is still happy to answer more questions if there are more, but we can switch off the recording then. We can ask off the record.
Yeah.
And